On a Sunday morning in July 2015, someone hijacked the Twitter account of one of the most secretive surveillance companies on Earth, changed the bio, posted a magnet link to 400 gigabytes of internal files, and then wrote, "Since we have nothing to hide, we're publishing all our emails, files, and source code." The company had been selling spyware to governments across 35 countries, including some that were actively targeting journalists and dissidents. By that afternoon, the entire world was reading their receipts. One hacker, never caught. And the story gets stranger from there. The company was called Hacking Team, based in Milan, Italy. They made what the industry politely calls lawful intercept software. Government-grade spyware that could silently take over your phone or laptop, activate your camera, read your encrypted messages, and log every keystroke, all without triggering a single alert. Their clients were governments, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and their pitch was straightforward. Your suspects are going dark. They're using encryption. You need to get inside their devices before the encryption kicks in. We can do that. Governments paid millions for that capability, and Hacking Team claimed, publicly, repeatedly, that they had a strict ethics policy. They said they would never sell to authoritarian regimes or countries on human rights watch lists. The 400 gigabytes proved otherwise. Hacking Team was founded in 2003 by two Italian security researchers, Alberto Ornaghi and Marco Valeri. They'd originally built a tool for network traffic analysis, something IT teams and law enforcement could use to monitor networks. By the mid-2000s, they pivoted hard into offensive capabilities and started selling directly to governments. By 2015, they had around 50 employees and a product called Remote Control System, internally nicknamed Galileo. It worked by getting a small implant onto the target's device. Once installed, it was essentially invisible. It could intercept signal messages before they encrypted. It could turn on a microphone without the light activating. It could exfiltrate files silently over Wi-Fi. Licenses ran between $200,000 and $2 million depending on scope. A research group called Citizen Lab, based at the University of Toronto, had been tracking Hacking Team's spyware in the wild for years before the hack. They found it being used against journalists in Morocco, against political dissidents in Ethiopia, against human rights lawyers in the UAE. In 2014, a United Nations expert report flagged Sudan as a likely Hacking Team client, at a time when Sudan was under an international arms embargo. Hacking Team publicly denied it, called Citizen Lab's methodology speculative. The invoices said otherwise. July 5, 2015, a Sunday, someone posts from Hacking Team's own Twitter account. The handle, the verified badge, all of it hijacked. The bio is rewritten to mock the company, and then comes the torrent link. 400 gigabytes. Every internal email going back years. Source code, customer contracts, internal security audits, staff salaries. Within hours, it was downloaded worldwide. Journalists, researchers, and governments were all reading simultaneously. The hacker responsible later claimed to be Phineas Fisher, a pseudonym. Not a nation-state operation, not a team. One individual. And in 2016, Phineas Fisher published a detailed technical breakdown of exactly how the intrusion was carried out. It started with a zero-day exploit in an embedded router on Hacking Team's network. From that initial foothold, the attacker spent months quietly moving laterally through internal systems, escalating privileges, mapping the infrastructure, staying below detection thresholds. Eventually, they reached a backup system that had stored credentials for almost everything. The final exfiltration was patient and methodical. Hacking Team's own internal security practices, as described in their leaked emails, were treated as an operational afterthought. The company that sold infiltration tools to governments had not seriously stress-tested whether someone could do the same to them. The 400 gigabytes was a nightmare for 35 governments and a goldmine for every journalist who covered surveillance. The client list: Sudan, Bahrain, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Morocco, Russia. The list ran across continents. Sudan alone had paid over $1 million for RCS access, while under active EU and US arms embargoes. The invoices were dated, the wire transfers were documented, the internal emails were arguably worse. Executives debated in writing whether to continue contracts with clients they knew were using the tools to target opposition journalists. The debate was rarely about ethics, it was about liability and optics. The contracts usually continued. The FBI and DEA appeared in the documents too, as paying clients with active renewal discussions underway. And then there was the source code itself. By releasing Hacking Team's actual exploit arsenal, Phineas Fisher effectively handed the world a map of unpatched vulnerabilities that Hacking Team had been quietly hoarding. Adobe Flash had 3 0 days in the dump. Windows had another. iOS had one. Within days, Adobe, Microsoft, Apple, Mozilla, and Google were all rushing emergency patches. Security researchers called it one of the largest simultaneous vulnerability disclosure events they'd ever seen. Except none of it was coordinated or responsible. It was just dropped. Hacking Team's CEO sent an internal email the week of the hack, claiming the company would recover. It didn't. At least not as the same entity. Major clients quietly suspended contracts. The Italian government investigated. The UN referred Sudan's Hacking Team usage to its sanctions committee. Congressional staffers in the U.S. started asking uncomfortable questions about the FBI's procurement from foreign surveillance vendors. Citizen Lab, the research group that had been dismissed as speculative for years, now had literal receipts. Government officials who had denied using Hacking Team tools faced documented evidence to the contrary. Some doubled down, some went quiet. Some offered vague statements about ongoing reviews. Hacking Team rebranded in 2019 as Memento Labs. Most of the original leadership had departed. The product quietly continued in some form. The new company has never confirmed or denied its current client list. Phineas Fisher? Still anonymous, still never identified. The FBI placed them on its most wanted list. Europol issued alerts. In the years after, Fisher claimed responsibility for other hacks, including a breach of a Panamanian law firm tied to offshore shell companies, where they donated the stolen funds to a Kurdish cooperative. No arrest has ever been made. Here's what I think most coverage of the story gets wrong. The Hacking Team breach is usually framed as a one-time event. A dramatic whistleblow, a rogue hacker, a cautionary tale about corporate security hygiene. But that framing lets the structural problem off the hook. The surveillance for hire industry operates in a deliberate regulatory gray zone. It's not selling conventional weapons, so arms export controls apply loosely. It's not a telecom, so wiretapping law doesn't cleanly govern it. It sells to governments, which gives it political cover. And the actual end use, surveilling journalists, opposition politicians, activists, is almost never scrutinized by the seller in any enforceable way. After July 2015, did this industry contract? No. NSO Group, an Israeli firm, grew dramatically through the late 2010s. Their spyware, Pegasus, was later found on the phones of journalists connected to the investigation into Jamal Khashoggi's murder, on politicians in Europe, on activists across the Middle East and South Asia. It took a second massive coordinated exposure, the Pegasus Project in 2021, involving 80 journalists across 17 media organizations, to generate any meaningful regulatory response. And even then, the U.S. added NSO Group to an export blacklist, but no criminal charges followed. The tools kept operating. The cycle is consistent. Private sector builds offensive capability, sells it to governments with minimal due diligence. Tools get used against civilians, researcher or hacker exposes it. Brief international outrage, regulatory murmur, rebranding or new vendor. Repeat. What Phineas Fisher understood, and what oversight bodies still seem unable to operationalize, is that in this specific industry, accountability doesn't come from formal channels. It comes from someone deciding to drag the private communications of executives into public view. Whether that's a legitimate or a dangerous way to create accountability is a serious question. Hacking teams' clients included not just authoritarian regimes, but also law enforcement agencies and democracies. The data dump didn't discriminate. Ongoing investigations, informant identities, sensitive law enforcement operations, all of it was in that 400 gigabytes. That tension doesn't have a clean answer, but it's the one worth sitting with. One hacker, one Sunday, 400 gigabytes, and suddenly 35 governments were explaining invoices they'd never meant anyone to see. If you want to see how this same pattern played out 6 years later with Pegasus, and why it reached all the way into the phones of heads of state, that video is up next. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of story, and I'll see you there.